Send more paramedics.
August of 1985 saw the release of one of the greatest zombie films of all time. And we're not talking about George Romero's Day of the Dead, though some will argue that particular sequel deserves to be in the conversation as well. Instead, we're talking about Dan O'Bannon's punk rock horror comedy, Return of the Living Dead, which introduced the world to speedy, brain-craving zombies, who also have a thing or two to say when they're feeling chatty. The movie was by no means a blockbuster, but it did very respectable business, making around $30 million worldwide off of a very minuscule budget. Naturally, a follow-up would be necessary in the eyes of that film's producer, Tom Fox, who assumed the Living Dead title was due for the franchise treatment, in the vein of a Friday the 13th. It would take 3 years, but we did eventually get a new Return of the Living Dead, which brought along some old faces to mix in with the new. But living up to the greatness of the first film would be no easy feat. And as it would turn out, this movie was much more of a slog to make than its predecessor. If you're ready to party one more time, grab a bowl of brains and find out just what happened to Return of the Living Dead Part 2.
Pardon me, but could you tell me who the President of the United States is?
Harry Truman.
Who's Harry Truman?
As mentioned, producer Tom Fox was eager to capitalize off of the success of the first Return of the Living Dead, which was a hit overseas, especially in Japan. He decided to finance the sequel himself, figuring he couldn't miss if the budget was under $10 million, and he hired the right people to bring the dead to life. Original writer and director Dan O'Bannon was not interested in coming back to this world, but gave his blessing for a sequel to be made without him, so Fox would have to seek out new blood. Oddly enough, two of the original film stars, Don Calfa and James Karen, had taken it upon themselves to write their own screenplays for the sequel. Sadly for them though, Fox wasn't interested in either of their takes. Around this time, a fellow named Ken Widerhorn was attempting to break out of a rut. He'd been struggling with the label of a horror film director after making two moderately successful thrillers, 1977's Nazi zombie nightmare, Shockwaves, and the 1981 slasher Eyes of a Stranger. His most recent film at the time had been Meatballs 2, though it was filmed under a different title and turned into a Meatballs movie by the distributor. Ken was taking a writing class, hoping to up his screenwriting game under the tutelage of the legendary screenwriting professor Robert McKee. Though he was trying to get away from horror films, Widerhorn ended up writing a comedic script that featured zombies. Soon after he was finished, the script ended up on Tom Fox's desk. Fox saw an opportunity to take Widerhorn's original script, change a few things around, and turn it into a Return of the Living Dead sequel. Though he was supposedly not even impressed by his own script, Widerhorn agreed to direct under the stipulation that the movie lean more on the comedy side of things. Fox agreed, because part of the first movie's charm was its morbid sense of humor, so he allowed his new director to go a little broader with the humor. Ken's vision for the film was so far left of horror that he even referred to his new movie as being the Police Academy of horror movies. That could have been one of the first signs that things were not going to work out quite as well as they did with the first film. While the movie wouldn't exactly be a direct sequel to the first outing, Ken wanted it to have some kind of connective tissue to it, so he suggested bringing back a large chunk of the original film's cast. James Karen, despite not having his script agreed to, was down to return because he was friends with Tom Fox. Karen didn't much like the new script, but figured collaborating with the same cast from the first film would make for a fun experience. However, Tom Matthews was less enthused about returning. In fact, he told Fangoria in an interview for Friday the 13th Part 6 that if there were to be a Return of the Living Dead sequel, he would not be a part of it. Eventually, Matthews did come aboard because, unlike some of the other participants, he warmed to the idea of making it a more humorous affair. Additionally, he and James Karen had struck up a genuine friendship on the first one, and the opportunity to do their shtick again appealed to both men. But the plan to bring back the rest of the original cast fell through. Beverly Randolph, who played final girl Tina in the first one, was under the impression that she was going to be asked back for the sequel, but was surprised to see it announced in the trades without so much as a phone call. Similarly, Don Kaffa, who portrayed Ernie the Mortician in the original film, had to audition for a role in the sequel and didn't get it. Clu Gulager, who played Bert in the first one, was never even asked back because he didn't get along with anyone on set the first time around. The sequel was given a budget of $6.2 million, more money than they had for the O'Bannon picture. Returning to do the makeup effects would be Kenny Myers, who worked on the first The Living Dead under strenuous conditions because he had to replace the original artist hired. While Myers wasn't in love with the new script either, thinking it was too silly, he appreciated that he had more time and money to work with, and eventually employed up to 30 makeup artists to work on the copious amounts of zombies, most of which were portrayed by Los Angeles locals. There would be about 6 main zombie actors, including Brian Peck, who featured in the first film. And these performers played multiple ghouls throughout the picture in an effort to save money on casting. Also not a fan of the sequel screenplay, boy, those are really piling up, aren't they? Was the first film's production designer, William Stout. He detested the script so much that not only did he refuse to be a part of it, but he banned the film from using any of his original designs, including the infamous Tar Man, who would return for just a cameo in the sequel. The Tar Man would once again be played by actor Alan Troutman, although the design was significantly changed as to not replicate the one that we all know and love. Return of the Living Dead Part 2 was not an easy movie to make. Things got off to a rocky start when producer Tom Fox casually announced in an interview with Variety that the movie was going to be a non-union show, which naturally led to picketing outside of filming locations from pissed-off union members, disrupting shooting for days. Though that was eventually sorted out, the movie was further plagued by bad weather. They were shooting in the winter, so even in LA, it got pretty cold at night. And to add insult to injury, it was unusually rainy and windy, making conditions rather uncomfortable for all involved. Things were so bad for a while that Widerhorn joked to Fangoria that he regretted writing "night exterior" at the beginning of nearly every scene heading. And if you listen to the audio commentary, he admits that he couldn't wait for production to end. Furthermore, he ultimately felt that he couldn't get along with the actors because he was too immersed in the film's effects, not to mention the time constraints that they were all under.
Before we continue with our video, here's a reminder to click the Store tab on any of our JoBlo channels and browse our collection of the latest and freshest designs in our merch store. Go get you some.
Further complicating matters was the fact that one of the film's leads was a 12-year-old kid, Michael Kenworthy, who was cast in the role of Jesse after a nationwide search for the actor, was only allowed to film for 4 hours a day because of child labor rules. Since he's in a large bulk of the movie, the filmmakers had to rush to shoot all of his scenes at the beginning of the night because he had to leave at around 10 p.m. This made scheduling the film extremely difficult, and because he was somewhat new to the business, Kenworthy supposedly had trouble hitting his marks and following direction, which put them even further behind schedule. In short, the actors were not having a good time. In a documentary made years later, Don Calfa related that he'd received phone calls from both James Karen and Tom Matthews, telling him that he'd been lucky to miss out on the sequel, that they were miserable and unsatisfied with what they were making. What became clear to many on set was that their director had an almost dismissive attitude toward his own material and the horror genre as a whole. A rift grew between the director and his cast as his ambivalence rubbed people the wrong way. Tom Matthews would quip years later that his favorite part of making Part 2 was the craft service table, which was supposedly one of the only improvements that the sequel offered. Eventually, Widerhorn even fell out with the producers as well. Without the director's knowledge, Tom Fox had gone ahead and hired a composer to score the movie. Once Widerhorn found out and heard the score, he refused to use it and phoned the production company, Lorimar Pictures, in an effort to persuade them to tell Fox that the score was unusable. The head of the studio agreed, and Widerhorn was able to throw out the unwanted music and bring aboard his own composer. After post-production, Lorimar Pictures tested the film quite a bit, supposedly in an effort to find out just how to market it. Living Dead 2 was their first horror film, and the company was unsure how to sell their slapsticky zombie comedy to the public. Perhaps surprisingly to some of its detractors, the film supposedly tested fairly well, actually better than Widerhorn thought that it would. Opting to sell it to the loyal horror crowd, Lorimar's trailers downplayed the comedy in favor of making the movie look like a straightforward zombie thriller. Deceptive marketing at its finest. If nothing else, the movie's poster is still memorably chilling, if not a little reminiscent of the poster for Fright Night, which came out 3 years earlier. Return of the Living Dead Part 2 was released on January 15, 1988. It opened in 5th place with $3 million, on its way to an early grave to the tune of $9 million domestic. Tom Fox was not going to have his version of the Friday the 13th franchise after all, and he eventually sold the Living Dead rights to Trimark, which would go on to make a third film in the series 5 years later, although that one jettisoned the comedy and familiar faces altogether for a darker, scarier zombie tale. Return of the Living Dead 2 isn't close to being in the same league as its predecessor, but it does have its champions, people who appreciate its goofy hijinks and the tenuous homages to the first film. If nothing else, some of us have a lingering sense of nostalgia for it because of its generous presence on cable TV back in the late 80s and early 90s. And one has to admit that the actors look like they're having fun, even if they weren't. It'll never be mistaken for a masterpiece, but its lack of brains might just be what keeps us talking about it to this day.
Thank you for clicking on our video, everybody. If you like what you saw here, please make sure you like the video and subscribe and share with your friends who like this sort of content. JoBlo remains an independent company, and we appreciate all of your support.